Kurt Franz kept a photo album. He had bound it himself, with a green cloth cover, and had given it a title written by hand on the first page, Die schönen Zeiten, The Good Times. The album contained images of the camp's SS men during celebrations, football matches, and outings to the river. There were photographs of dogs and well-kept gardens. Franz appeared on several pages with a relaxed expression, his uniform immaculate, sometimes with his dog Barry at his side. The photographs looked like the memory album of a summer camp. The problem was that they had been taken in Treblinka between 1942 and 1943, while the camp was processing the extermination of approximately 900,000 people. Franz kept the album. He never destroyed it. When he was arrested in Germany in 1959, the album was in his home. Investigators found it and confiscated it. It became one of the few pieces of direct photographic evidence of the camp. Because Treblinka had been designed to leave no trace, and it almost succeeded. What Franz's album did not show is what this story attempts to reconstruct. Treblinka was not a concentration camp. It was not a place where people were interned in order to be exploited or terrorized indefinitely. It was a pure extermination camp, a category the Nazi regime built specifically for a single purpose: to kill people in the shortest possible time and with the least possible friction. Between the 23rd of July 1942 and the 19th of October 1943, approximately 900,000 people arrived at Treblinka in freight trains. Fewer than 100 survived. The distance between those two figures is the camp. But numbers do not capture what the camp was in its daily operation, in its psychological architecture, in the specific cruelty of the men who ran it, and in the decisions they made hour after hour. To understand the darkest side of Treblinka, it is not enough to know how many died. One has to know how those who were about to die lived in the final hours before death, how the men who killed them functioned, and what kind of existence was endured by those who were forced to take part in the mechanism from within. Let us begin with the design of deception, which was the first and most fundamental darkness of the camp. Treblinka was located in a pine forest in northeastern Poland, about 80 kilometers from Warsaw. The choice of location was deliberate. The forest concealed the installations from the outside, and the railway line connecting Warsaw with Białystok passed nearby, making it possible to divert trains directly to the camp without the diversion being visible from the main stations. The private branch line leading from the main track to the camp's internal platform was less than 4 kilometers long. On that branch line, the reality of the ordinary world ended. The platform was the first stage of the system of deception that Franz Stangl, the camp commandant from September 1942, had designed with a meticulousness that survivors would describe decades later as the most disturbing of all the camp's characteristics. Stangl had arrived at Treblinka after having run the Sobibor extermination camp, with direct experience in the mechanisms of Operation Reinhard and enough judgment to diagnose the problems left by his predecessor. Irmfried Eberl, the first commandant, had caused an operational collapse during the camp's initial months by authorizing the arrival of trains that exceeded the actual extermination capacity available, producing situations in which thousands of people remained alive for hours on the platform while the camp was unable to process them. That chaos had made visible what the camp did, and visibility was the greatest operational danger to the system. Stangl ordered the construction of a fake railway station. It was a building with a painted wooden facade, with a clock on the exterior wall that always showed 3 o'clock in the afternoon because it was a painted clock, without any mechanism. There were signs pointing to real cities in Poland: Białystok, Włocławek, Warsaw. There was a ticket office with a window and a fare sign. There were benches in a waiting room. The intended effect was specific. When the human mind is confronted with a familiar object, even if that object is inexplicably out of place, it takes longer to conclude that something is profoundly wrong than it does when confronted with something radically unknown. A clock without a mechanism on the wall of a railway station suggests neglect, not extermination. And every minute of delay in reaching that conclusion was one less minute in which resistance was possible. The arrival of a transport followed a protocol that Stangl had standardized after taking command of the camp. The entire train, which could consist of between 50 and 60 wagons carrying up to 120 people each, did not enter the platform all at once. Only 20 wagons could fit at a time. The rest remained on the outer branch line, waiting while the first group was processed. That wait could last hours for those in the rear wagons. During those hours, without water, without ventilation, in the heat of the Polish summer or the cold of winter. A portion of the occupants of each wagon died before the doors were opened. When the doors opened, instructions came over, loudspeakers in German, Polish, and Yiddish, always with the same message. They had arrived at a transit camp. They would be transferred east for work, but first they had to go through the disinfection and shower process required by Reich sanitary regulations at all transit points. They had to hand over their valuables for safekeeping. They would be returned after the shower. They had to undress and remember the exact place where they left their shoes, tied together in pairs so that they could recover them easily. That last detail, the tying together of the shoes, was perhaps the most calculated of all. A person who has been instructed to remember where they left their shoes is implicitly accepting the promise that they will return to collect them. The brain that accepts that promise is a brain that is not processing the possibility that it will never need those shoes again. And a brain that does not process that possibility does not produce the panic that might have generated resistance. The selection took place on the platform. Men to the right, women and children to the left. The elderly, the sick, and those who could not walk were separated and taken to the Lazarette, which had a Red Cross flag over the entrance and appeared to be an infirmary. It was not an infirmary. It was a pit dug into the ground, surrounded by a wooden palisade, where an SS man shot those who had been taken there in the back of the neck. August Miete was the main person in charge of the Lazarette during most of the camp's existence. Miete personally shot thousands of people in that pit, including infants torn from their mothers' arms and small children who had been separated from the main groups because the SS had calculated that they could not walk to the gas chambers at the pace required by the protocol. The Lazarette was the first visible fork in the process, and its camouflage as a medical service was the first concrete lie with a name and a flag. The next ones came without signs. From the undressing area, the route to the gas chambers continued through a corridor, the SS called the Schlauch, the tube, and which the Sonderkommando prisoners who knew it called the Himmelfahrtstrasse, the road to heaven. The ironic name contained information that no one in that corridor could use. The Schlauch was about 100 meters long and 4 meters wide, flanked on both sides by wire fences interwoven with fresh pine branches, regularly replaced so they would not dry out and allow anyone to see through them. The curve at the end of the corridor was designed so that the gas chamber building would not be visible until one was less than 20 meters from the entrance. In those 20 meters, with the body naked and guards and dogs on both sides, there was nowhere to go except forward. The gas chamber building had a blue and white cloth curtain on its facade, with a Star of David embroidered in the center. The star made the building look like a synagogue or a ritual bath. On the door there was a sign, Heckenholt Foundation, Institute for Baths and Disinfection. Inside, a short corridor led to the chamber doors. The walls of the corridor were lined with wood. On the ceiling there were shower heads, installed there for the same reason as the sign on the door, so that whoever entered would look up, see what they expected to see, and take a little longer to realize that the floor could no longer be distinguished from the ceiling because there were too many people in the same space and their feet no longer touched the ground. Treblinka's original gas chambers were 3 in number, built in the summer of 1942 with wooden walls and a total capacity of approximately 600 people. From the autumn of that year onward, when the volume of transports from the Warsaw Ghetto systematically exceeded that capacity, Stengel ordered the construction of a new brick building with 10 larger chambers. Jankiel Wiernik, a carpenter in the Sonderkommando, participated directly in the construction of that building. In his testimony, published clandestinely in Warsaw in 1944 while the camp still existed, he described the experience of building with his own hands the structures he knew would be used to kill because he had already been in the camp for weeks and had already seen what the 3 original chambers did. Wiernik described that knowledge as the worst form of torture the camp could inflict. Not the physical labor, not the hunger, but knowing exactly what everything one did was for. The 10 new chambers had a capacity of between 200 and 400 people each. The gas system used carbon monoxide produced by a diesel engine captured from a Soviet tank, connected to the chambers by pipes. The engine was operated by Ivan Marchenko, a Ukrainian guard known in the camp as Ivan the Terrible, whose presence in the engine room was a constant in survivor testimonies. Marchenko did not only operate the engine, He used a metal pipe about 1 meter long to beat people as they were pushed into the chambers, especially those who tried to resist at the door or who fell and blocked the passage of those coming behind them. The function of the pipe was not disciplinary in any functional sense. The people were going to die anyway in the following minutes. The function of the pipe was the personal expression of something that the testimonies of Sonderkommando survivors consistently describe as enjoyment. Death by carbon monoxide took between 20 and 30 minutes from the moment the engine was switched on, longer if the engine failed, which happened with a frequency later camp records describe as regular. When the engine failed, the people inside the chambers did not die, but they could not leave either, because the doors were closed from the outside with metal bars. The camp personnel waited outside until the engine was repaired and restarted. Sonderkommando survivors who worked near the chambers described hearing, during those waits, the sounds coming from inside, the blows against the steel doors, the voices, the prayers, the cries of children. They also described the transition into silence when the engine began working again. Gil Rajman arrived at Treblinka in October 1942 from the Vengrov ghetto and was selected for the Sonderkommando of the upper camp, the sector that worked directly at the gas chambers. Rajman was a dentist by profession, and that skill determined his specific assignment. He was part of the group that examined the mouths of corpses after each gassing cycle in order to extract dental gold. In the testimony he wrote decades later, Rajman described that task with a precision that requires no further comment, opening the mouth of a dead person and extracting their gold teeth with a pair of pliers, repeated hundreds of times a day, every day, without exception, until the number of people killed in the chambers that day had been fully processed. What the testimonies of survivors from Treblinka's upper camp describe most consistently is not the scale of death, which is almost impossible to process in personal terms, but the specific details that made the task humanly unbearable. Recognizing among the corpses someone familiar, a neighbor from one's ghetto of origin, a relative who had arrived on a later transport. The posture of the bodies, after gassing, stacked vertically under such pressure that rigor mortis kept the muscles locked against one another, and hooks and levers had to be used to separate them. The condition of the bodies in the summer months, when the temperature accelerated decomposition during the hours required for the entire process. The sound of the hammers used to crush the bones that had not completely burned on the cremation grates. The cremation grates were an addition from 1943. Ordered by Heinrich Himmler after an inspection of the Operation Reinhard camps in the autumn of 1942. Himmler concluded that the mass graves represented an unacceptable evidentiary risk as the Eastern Front advanced westward. The Soviet armies that took the territory could dig up the graves and find evidence of the extermination. The solution was to exhume and burn all the bodies already buried, as well as to incinerate all future bodies instead of burying them. Herbert Floss, an SS man, transferred from Auschwitz specifically to supervise the construction and operation of the cremation system at Treblinka, designed the grates using railway rails placed on concrete blocks in parallel rows, with enough space between the rails to place firewood underneath. The bodies were stacked on the grates in a specific order that Floss had determined experimentally. First, a layer of wood, then the bodies of women, which burned more efficiently because of their higher body fat content, then men, and finally children on the top layer. Approximately 300 kilos of wood for every group of 400 or 500 bodies. The grates operated without interruption, day and night, for months. While the grates burned, the Sonderkommando of the upper camp had to exhume bodies from the mass graves that had been filled during the previous months. Those bodies had been buried for weeks or months. Their advanced state of decomposition meant that some fragmented as they were extracted. The smell was of an intensity that testimonies describe as impossible to withstand without losing consciousness, and yet they had to withstand it for entire workdays because stopping without authorization was an infraction, and an infraction meant immediate execution. Some members of the Sonderkommando managed to obtain alcohol from the belongings confiscated from the deportees and used it to anesthetize the time they spent in the upper camp. Others prayed quietly while they worked. Others developed what the testimonies describe as functional dissociation, a state in which the movements continued automatically while the mind withdrew from the body performing them. It was not a chosen strategy. It was what remained when every other way of being present became unbearable. The German and Austrian staff of the camp, the approximately 35 SS men who ran it, had comfortable barracks in the administrative sector, with individual rooms, a canteen with adequate food, a recreation room with a gramophone and books, and a small zoo with exotic animals that Stangl had ordered to be built. Letters sent by Treblinka SS men to their families, confiscated after the war and now part of several court archives, describe the Polish weather, the flowers in the garden, the animals in the zoo, the monotony of life in the East, without any reference to what was happening 50 meters from the barracks during working hours. Franz Stangl was the most extreme example of that compartmentalization. Stangl was meticulous in his appearance, his uniform always immaculate, his boots polished, his hair combed. He rode on horseback around the camp perimeter. He supervised train arrivals from the watchtowers with binoculars. He insisted that the areas of the camp visible from the platform be clean and orderly. In his testimony to Gita Sereni, given during weeks of interviews in the Düsseldorf prison where he was serving a life sentence, Stangl described the deportees he processed as Ladung, cargo. He said he had learned not to look at them as people, because if he looked at them as people, the work became impossible. Sereni asked him when he had learned that. Stangl said in the first weeks that it had been a deliberate learning process, a conscious decision, that he had understood he had to choose between looking and functioning, and that he had chosen to function. Kurt Franz was different. Franz did not need the psychological distance that Stangl had cultivated. The testimonies of survivors and the records of the 1965 Düsseldorf trial, where Franz was sentenced to life imprisonment, describe him as a man who participated in violence with a disposition that even his own SS colleagues described in some testimonies as excessive by the standards of the camp. Franz always carried a pistol and a whip. He shot prisoners for minor infractions or with no discernible infraction at all. His dog Barry, a Saint Bernard trained to attack people when Franz gave the order, was an instrument of personal torture that Franz used regularly on the platform, in the Schlauch, and in the camp yard. What the testimonies emphasize about Franz's behavior is its character as spectacle. The executions he carried out tended to occur in front of other prisoners, with a theatricality that some historians have interpreted as an expression of total impunity. In Treblinka, where the victims died in absolute anonymity, where there was no record of their arrival or their death, where the entire system was designed so that no trace of what happened would remain. The actions of the SS had a captive audience that could never denounce them because that audience was going to die as well. Franz acted with that knowledge. The album he titled The Good Times was the clearest manifestation of that internalized impunity. Not only was he not afraid of being discovered, he documented what he did as a personal memory of something he considered positive. Gustav Wagner was responsible for the upper camp, the area of the gas chambers and the cremation grates. Wagner was known among the Sonderkommando as the Wolf. The testimonies that describe his behavior in the upper camp consistently indicate that Wagner personally killed prisoners he considered too slow or too weak for the work, usually by beating them instead of sending them to the Lazarette or to the chambers. The distinction mattered to the prisoners who witnessed it. It meant that Wagner did not need the official procedure in order to kill, that he could do it at any moment and for any reason. That arbitrariness without protocol was an additional instrument of terror imposed on the Sonderkommando of the upper camp, who already lived under the structural terror of the camp. Wagner fled to Brazil after the war and lived there under a false name for decades. He was identified in 1978 by a survivor who recognized him. Before he could be extradited, he committed suicide. He was never tried. The Ukrainian guards, known as Tronikis after the Troniki training camp where they had been instructed, were Soviet prisoners of war who had agreed to collaborate with the SS as an alternative to dying in German prisoner of war camps, where mortality in 1941 and 1942 was extraordinarily high. Between 90 and 120, Tronikis served at Treblinka at any given time. Their main function was direct physical contact with the deportees. They opened the wagons, drove people along the platform, guarded the Schlauch, and operated the chamber sector. Survivor testimonies described the Tronikis as the most directly violent component of the camp in their everyday treatment of prisoners, possibly because the physical closeness of their function exposed them more constantly than the SS to the reactions of the people they were killing, and fear of those reactions expressed itself as preventive and systematic violence. The Jewish Sonderkommandos in the camp occupied a position that survivor testimonies attempt to describe even though no fully adequate prior vocabulary exists for it. They were not collaborators in the sense in which that term is normally used, because the choice given to them when they were selected was not between collaborating and not collaborating, but between working in the camp or dying in the chambers that same day. Some chose to die. Most chose to work. knowing that the work was temporary, that Sonderkommando rotations meant they would be executed and replaced in weeks or months, and that what they had chosen was therefore not life, but a postponement of death purchased at the price of participating in the extermination process of their own people. The Jewish Sonderkommandos in the camp occupied a position that survivor testimonies attempt to describe, even though no fully adequate prior vocabulary exists for it. They were not collaborators in the sense in which that term is normally used, because the choice given to them when they were selected was not between collaborating and not collaborating, but between working in the camp or dying in the chambers that same day. Some chose to die. Most chose to work, knowing that the work was temporary, that Sonderkommando rotations meant they would be executed and replaced in weeks or months, and that what they had chosen was therefore not life, but a postponement of death purchased at the price of participating in the extermination process of their own people. Abraham Bomba had been a barber in Częstochowa before the war. At Treblinka, he was assigned to the group of barbers whose function was to cut the hair of women in the undressing barrack after they had removed their clothes and before they entered the Schlauch. The cutting was quick, done with scissors, without a razor, reducing the hair to a few centimeters so it could be packed and sent to Germany, where it was used in the manufacture of industrial textiles. Bomba cut the hair of between 100 and 150 women a day, with another 20 or 25 barbers doing the same in the same room. The work continued as long as there were women to process, without pause, in silence, because speaking to the deportees was forbidden and punished. At some point during the weeks he had spent in the camp, Bomba recognized among the women arriving for the haircut his wife and his sister. Decades later, in the interview filmed by Claude Lanzmann for the documentary Shoah, Bomba interrupted his account at that point and was unable to continue for several seconds. When he resumed, he described what he had done. He kept cutting hair. He knew that any visible reaction would not change what was going to happen to her and could determine what would happen to him. Bomba cut the hair of his wife and his sister in silence and watched them enter the Schlauch. In August 1942, a special transport arrived at Treblinka from Warsaw. Among the deportees was Janusz Korczak, a physician, educator, and writer of renown before the war, director of the Jewish orphanage Nas Dom in the Warsaw Ghetto, who had repeatedly refused offers to be exempted from deportation in exchange for abandoning the 200 children under his care. On the day of the deportation from the Umschlagplatz, Korczak put on his best uniform, took the orphanage flag, and led the children in an orderly column toward the wagons. The children walked in silence, well-dressed, some carrying toys or books. Witnesses who observed the column from outside the Umschlagplatz described seeing something that did not fit any deportation scene they had witnessed before. A group of children marching with dignity because the man leading them had decided that this was the last thing he could give them. On the platform at Treblinka, according to the testimony of an SS man recorded in later trials, Franz Stangl offered to spare Korczak's life if he agreed to separate himself from the children and let them enter the Schlauch alone. Korczak refused the offer. He kept the children calm by telling them stories during the hours of waiting on the platform. He entered the Schlauch with them and continued on to the gas chambers. August Miette, responsible for the Lazarette, had developed in that space a procedure that survivor testimonies describe with a consistency that leaves no doubt as to its systematic nature. The Lazarette was surrounded by a wooden palisade 2 meters high, with a single entrance in the form of a narrow passage. Inside, there was a pit dug into the ground, approximately 20 meters long and several meters deep. Access to the pit was from its upper edge. People were led to that edge and shot in the back of the neck. The bodies fell into the pit. Miette personally shot people in the Lazarette for months. The testimonies describing him at that work emphasize 2 details. The first is speed. The pace at which the Lazarette processed people was determined by the overall rhythm of the camp, which depended on how many trains arrived that day. And there were days when the volume of people sent to the Lazarette for being elderly, sick, or too small to walk exceeded what one person could kill quickly enough. On those days, Miette had help. The second detail is a scene described independently in several testimonies. The smallest children, the infants, arrived at the Lazarette because they had been separated from their mothers on the platform or because their mothers had been sent directly to the chambers. Miette executed them as well. In some cases, according to testimonies, he did not shoot them but smashed them against the wooden palisade before throwing them into the pit. After the war, Miette lived in West Germany under his real name. He was not identified as a Treblinka perpetrator until the 1960s. He was tried in Düsseldorf in 1965, sentenced to life imprisonment, and died in prison. Rotation was the most effective instrument of control over the Sonderkommando. When a group had spent too much time in the camp, when it knew too much about the camp layout and the guards' shifts, or simply when the moment the SS had determined in advance, without any announced specific criterion, had arrived. The entire group was executed and replaced with men selected from the next transport. The uncertainty over when that execution would come was part of the mechanism. A Sonderkommando that does not know when it is going to die is less willing to organize resistance because resistance requires temporal planning, and temporal planning requires at least a minimal horizon of certainty about the future. And yet, some members of the Sonderkommando survived for months, accumulating knowledge of the camp's structure, the guards' patterns of behavior, the shift schedules, and the location of weapons. And at some point in late 1942, as the mass deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto began to slow and rumors about the possible future dismantling of the camp began to circulate, some of those men began to speak to one another. Dr. Julian Korazycki was the first documented organizer of Treblinka's internal resistance. A Jewish physician from Warsaw, he had been selected as the camp doctor, and that position gave him a relative mobility inside the campgrounds that most Sonderkommando prisoners did not have. Korazycki began establishing contacts among the camp's different commandos, saving money confiscated from deportees' belongings to use for bribery, and studying the physical layout of the camp with the aim of planning a mass escape. In the spring of 1943, an SS guard found him with an amount of money he could not explain. Korazycki understood at that moment that the torture following his arrest would produce names, and that those names were all he had to protect. He took the poison he carried for that scenario and swallowed it before the guards could stop him. He died without revealing anything. After Korazycki's death, the organization passed into the hands of an informal committee in which Zelo Bloch, a captain in the Polish army before the war, the engineer Herschel Sperling, and the Czech physician Rudolf Masaryk held the main roles. The conspiracy was organized around three technical problems: how to obtain weapons from the camp arsenal, how to distribute them without being detected, and how to coordinate simultaneous action in an environment where communication between the different sectors of the camp was strictly forbidden and closely monitored. The solution to the first problem came through a locksmith in the Sonderkommando who managed to make an impression of the arsenal key in a piece of soap. With the help of a blacksmith, they made a copy. For several weeks, small groups of conspirators entered the arsenal with the copied key, removed weapons and ammunition, hid them at different points in the camp, and returned the weapons before their absence could be detected. Not all of the weapons returned. Little by little, in a process requiring a discipline and patience that seem astonishing in the context of the conditions in which they lived, the conspirators accumulated enough rifles, pistols, and grenades to arm several hundred men. The date chosen for the uprising was the 2nd of August 1943. The choice of time, mid-afternoon, was calculated. It was the hour when the guards' shifts were changing and when the heat reduced overall vigilance. The plan called for a small group to enter the arsenal with the copied key, load a cart with weapons covered by tools, and distribute the weapons to combat groups positioned throughout the camp. At the same time, designated groups would pour gasoline over the main buildings under the pretext of disinfection work. At a signal, a gunshot, the uprising would begin everywhere at once. What happened on the 2nd of August 1943 did not follow that plan. The arsenal group began removing weapons a few hours early in order to have more time, and an SS guard passing through the area noticed something irregular in the activity he was seeing. Before he could demand an explanation, one of the conspirators fired. The shot came a few minutes before the scheduled time, with some of the weapons still undistributed and several combat groups still out of their assigned positions. The uprising began in an improvised and partially disorganized way. The groups that had weapons attacked the guards closest to them. Others set fire to the buildings with the gasoline that had already been distributed. Explosions shook several points of the camp. Flames spread to the barracks, the warehouses, and part of the extermination sector installations. Columns of black smoke rose above the forest and were visible from several kilometers away. Hundreds of prisoners ran toward the barbed wire. At some points they broke through it or crossed over it. Those who got outside the camp perimeter ran toward the forest without knowing whether anyone out there could help them or kill them. The watchtowers immediately opened fire on those crossing the perimeter. Most of those who reached the forest were hunted down in the following days by SS units, German police, and local collaborators who had been ordered to search for them. It is estimated that between 200 and 300 people crossed the barbed wire. Most died in the first hours, or in the days that followed. According to estimates, historians have been able to establish from testimonies between 60 and 70 people survived. Some reached partisan groups in the forests. Others found refuge on Polish farms whose owners decided to hide them at the risk of their own lives. Samuel Willenberg, who had arrived at Treblinka in October 1942 and had survived almost a year in the Sonderkommando, was one of them. Richard Glazar, the Czech who would become one of the camp's most important witnesses, was another. Abraham Bomba, the barber who had cut the women's hair before they entered the chambers, was a third. Their testimonies, given in the decades after the war, are the main source for what is known today about the internal functioning of the camp. Inside the camp, those who had failed to escape were gathered together and executed. In the following weeks, the SS brought in 100 prisoners from other camps to complete the destruction of the installations. Those men demolished the barracks, blew up the gas chambers, tore up the tracks of the railway branch line, and leveled the ground. On the leveled land, they planted young pine trees and built a farm, which was handed over to a Ukrainian collaborator and his family with instructions to maintain the appearance that the land had always been farmland. When the Red Army reached the area in July 1944, it found a farm and a forest. It also found ashes, bone fragments, and soil that later analyses would show to be saturated with human remains. The Dusseldorf trial, held between 1964 and 1965, tried 10 people connected to Treblinka. Franz Stangl, who had been found in Brazil in 1967, thanks in part to the investigation of Simon Wiesenthal, was tried separately in 1970 and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in Dusseldorf prison in June 1971, days after his final interview with Gita Sereni. In that interview, the last of an extensive series, Stangl admitted for the first time that he considered himself morally responsible for what had happened in the camp. Sereni asked him how he defined that responsibility. Stangl replied that his guilt was having been there. Then he said that he had not been able to say more than that, although he had spent years trying to say something more. He died a few hours later. Kurt Franz was tried in Dusseldorf in 1965 and sentenced to life imprisonment. The photo album titled The Good Times was presented as evidence at his trial. Franz argued in his defense that the photographs only showed daily life in the camp and did not constitute evidence of the crimes of which he was accused. The court did not accept that argument. Treblinka as a physical place does not exist in the sense that Auschwitz or Dachau exist, with their barracks, their barbed wire, their buildings still standing. The SS men who demolished it in the autumn of 1943 were more successful in erasing the physical trace than their counterparts in other camps. What exists today on the site where the camp once stood is a memorial built after the war with irregular stones symbolically representing the destroyed communities. A space that visitors consistently describe as one in which the absence of visible structures produces an effect different from that of preserved camps. There is nothing to point to, nothing to document with a camera except trees and stones and earth. And that absence is also an accurate description of what Treblinka was, a place designed so that nothing would remain. The archaeologist Caroline Sturdy-Calls carried out the first systematic excavations of the site between 2010 and 2013, using ground-penetrating radar technology that made it possible to detect underground structures without physically excavating. The results confirmed what testimonies had described for decades: the dimensions of the mass graves, the location of the gas chambers, the path of the Schlauch. The ground-penetrating radar data also revealed that the soil of the site contained human remains in densities that no previous method had been able to estimate precisely. Not all the bodies had been exhumed and burned before the dismantling. Some had remained buried for 70 years beneath the pine trees the SS had planted to conceal what lay underneath. Kurt Franz's album, The Good Times, is now in the archives of the Dusseldorf court. It has a green cloth cover. The painted clock that always showed 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the facade of the fake station no longer exists because the station no longer exists. The cremation grates on which, by Himmler's documented order, the bodies of approximately 800,000 people burned were dismantled and buried. The railway rails that made up the grates were the same rails that had carried to the camp the people whose bodies burned upon them. The detail is so exact in its brutality that it seems invented. It is not. It is documented in the testimonies of the members of the Sonderkommando who assembled the grates and who, some of them, survived to describe exactly where the rails came from, how they were placed, what order the bodies followed in the layers, how much wood was needed for each group, how long it took to burn, and what remained at the end that had to be crushed with hammers so it could be scattered in the fields without leaving recognizable evidence of what it had been.